Kate Milafalcia, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. Happy May Day, May 1st, a very significant day on the calendar of almost everybody around the world throughout history, and we're going to talk about it. So let's get right down to it. May Day. What is the significance of May 1st? Well, it honors workers, it honors labor unions. Workers, people who punch a clock and work really, really hard for their income. However, it's also the traditional spring festival, ancient times globally. It marks the beginning of summer. Now, we're not saying this is the first day of summer. I'll explain the calendar in a minute, but it has pagan roots in the time leading up to summer. It began in Western culture in northern Western Europe as the day in the northern hemisphere of the return. It's exactly halfway between the spring equinox, day and night are equal, and the summer solstice, the longest amount of daylight on the calendar. And this marks that period of time right between there. And in that sense, it's a welcoming of summer because it's the lead up to longer and longer and longer days. Not the beginning of longer days, that's the equinox, but the lead up to, the big one. There is an ancient pagan connection to the northwestern European celebrations. Now, this is not necessarily true globally. There are other global traditions, but we're here in this hemisphere, so that's what we're talking about to the greatest extent. So May Day, as people think of it, maypoles, flowers, and all that stuff, it really goes back to the time before the Roman Republic. The earliest known celebration of the 1st of May, or this particular time of year, it's combined in two different celebrations that sort of overlapped. The first is the Floralia, which is the festival of Flora, the Roman goddess of flowers. Flora, flowers, which the Roman calendar's nuts, so we'll just say that it falls between April 27th and May 3rd. The other festival that's included in May Day's history is the Mayuna, which is the festival of Dionysus and Aphrodite. Those names ought to just sort of imply things. You've heard of Dionysus is like Bacchus, Aphrodite is like Venus. You see where I'm going with this. So they would celebrate this festival every 3 years during the entire month of May, and it was quite an event. So Floralia, to Flora, began with a theatrical performance. There's a lot of reference to it in ancient writing. Ovid, the poet Ovid, who wrote Metamorphoses, he wrote about the myths and the gods and goddesses. He said that on this day, hares and goats were released. So I looked up the significance of hares and goats, and I really could not find a direct link to Roman culture. Now, it may exist, and but people equate rabbits with Easter, with the celebration of Easter, and everything I looked up said that's a mistaken link. I guess the loose connection is it's a festival. Easter is a festival of abundance and reproduction and rebirth, and rabbits and hares are prolific in their reproduction, and somehow or other in the stew pot of ancient traditions it developed that significance. But anyway, hares and goats were released, and I don't know, like, were they let out of cages to run around the streets? I couldn't find anything. Perseus, an ancient writer, said the crowds were pelted, like they threw things at each other. They threw vetches, and I had to look that up. Vetches are actually, it's the entire genus of the legume family. Legumes are like peas, specifically though lentils and broad beans. So they threw plants at each other. They also threw regular beans, just, you know, the beans themselves, and lupins. So I thought that was interesting. We have lupins getting ready here now to bloom. It's that time of year. So the ritual of Florifertum was April 27th or May 3rd. Now, Florifertum comes from a combination in Latin of the word flora, for the goddess of spring, right? Flowers, not spring, flowers, and fertum, which it's derived from the verb to carry. So you can imagine processions through the streets, that kind of thing. And we have a modern equivalent of that. They would carry bundles of wheat ears, which I'm not even sure what that is, to a shrine, either to Flora, or it's pronounced Ceres, but in modern lingo, it's Ceres. Ceres was the goddess of grain, from whom we get cereal, the word cereal. Her daughter Persephone spent 6 months of the year down in hell. I guess she went to Florida in the winter. Sorry, I'm just joking. Anyway, this feast would end with competitions, kind of like Festivus, you know, feats of strength. And there were spectacles and sacrifices to Flora. The Maima, now this only happened, I'm unsure how to pronounce it. It's M-A-I, as in May in other languages. And it's the Maima. So we all know that it was, we do know that it was celebrated by the Emperor Commodus in the first couple of, during his reign, but during like the 100s AD, the first couple of centuries. And it lasted an entire month. It was called a dramatic nocturnal festival held every 3 years. And this ought to tell you a lot. It was also known as the orgies. That's where the word comes from. That these were secret rites that celebrated the mysteries of Dionysus and Aphrodite. And we both know what they're famous for. The government would pay for the torches and lights and any other expenses of these 30 all-night revels. So I imagine something like Mardi Gras, only probably worse. I don't know. So they had banquets and offerings and what's loosely termed licentiousness, giving license, you could do anything. And eventually this was suppressed for a while by the Emperor Constantine, who was a bit of a prig. And then they were restored again. Then they were suppressed again. The Emperor Arcadius and the Emperor Honorius both let it go and then suppressed it again. So, you know, eventually a lot of these pagan rites dissipated for the most part as big public spectacles, as the influence of other things occurred, and excuse me, as the Roman Empire began to slowly sort of disintegrate and the rise of other religions overshadowed it. In the Middle Ages, in Northern Europe, this sort of thing was still remembered. And the May Eve, the night before May 1st, was celebrated with bonfires at night, tying back to the all-night torch orgies. That's not what happened, just the bonfires. In Germanic countries, it eventually became Walpurgis Night. Now, this was to honor Saint Walpurgis, whose canonization was May 1st. So they, you know, they had a very hard time letting go of their pagan roots, and it leaks through all the time in these different events. But this is all traceable to pre-Christian celebrations. In Gaelic countries, so we're talking Ireland, Scotland, Wales, parts of France, maybe even in parts of Spain. May 1st, in the really Gaelic, what we think of, Irish, Scottish, it was called Beltane, or a word in Gaelic that I think is Ketsavan, but we're going to have to ask our friend Kate how to pronounce that. She is coming back soon. And also in Welsh, it was called Colin May, and there's another word in Welsh. So we have an Irish word and a Welsh word, which we'll have to ask her about. So the first really solid evidence that this is no longer pagan, but it still exists, was in 900 AD. And this was when the rural people used symbolically fires to bless their cattle and their livestock as they were moved on to summer pastures. So apparently they had large swaths of undeveloped land where they would set these herds loose and let them graze at will freely, free range. And things happened to them. I'm sure they were stolen, they were injured, or they were predated upon. And so to offset that, before they left, they forced these cattle to jump over a fire so they won't be stolen by the fairies. Yeah, I'm sure the fairies were doing the stealing. And also to protect their milk from being stolen. So I guess when you're poor and you're hungry and you see a stray cow, you might be tempted. But since the 18th century, May 1st kind of morphed into being associated with Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, this is where my memory, I'm not that old, but the tradition, my memory of May 1st comes in with the bringing of May flowers. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But May 1st also was the feast of St. Joseph. Now, St. Joseph, I think it's March 19th is the real feast of St. Joseph, but they also, so there's two feasts of St. Joseph. And on May 1st, they decided to honor St. Joseph, who's the patron saint of workers, and they did this in 1955. Pope Pius XII, he wanted to compete with the Communist International Workers' Day. So it became the Feast of St. Joseph to honor workers. And I'm sure that everyone is familiar with the notion of a maypole. That's an ancient tradition, dancing around a pole. And then the May Queen, crowning of the May Queen. And something we did as children, and I sometimes still do it for my neighbors, depending on who they are, do May baskets. You sneak out very, very early in the morning on May 1st or late the night before and leave fresh cut flowers on the doorstep of your neighbors to welcome, May. And a May bush, which is usually, it can be a growing plant outside you can decorate, like a Christmas tree on the outside, or just a branch, and you decorate it with flowers and ribbons and shells and lights. And I was going to do one and then I forgot, but I'm sure you can imagine. Actually, our flowers right now are kind of in flux. The ones that are good for picking and putting in a vase are not quite ready. And the ones like lilac are starting to dissipate their blossoms. They're in full bloom, but they're a little overblown. And so, they don't make for good bouquets because they're real messy. And plus, I'm a little allergic to lilac. It gives me the wheezes. I love it. They're beautiful. I have a lilac plant that's at least 100 years old. It was here before the house was here. So anyway, what I remember of May Day were the May processions. Mary, the month of May is the month of Mary in Catholic faith. I believe October as well, but I think October is more like the month of the rosary. I don't know. I could be confused. I usually am. But we would have these big celebrations for Mary. One of the things we did was a living rosary. That was a hoot. They would find all kinds of people in the congregation. And, as a child in Catholic school, you got conscripted. You had no choice. And they would string position a whole group of people in a line, organized like the decades of the rosary. And it was each person would lead the prayer when it was your turn. And this was outdoors. And it was all around the church. I can't imagine what the neighbors thought. And then there'd be a May procession where somebody would be crowned, the favorite female student would be crowned ultimate. That was the moment as the Queen of the May in honor of Mary. And we had all these hymns. And when I had my best friend and I lived on the same street, there were 7 kids in her family and 12 kids in my family. I'm sure the neighbors were delighted. And this time of year, we would load our 2 youngest sisters side by side into a wagon and put, dress up clothes on them and collect flowers, because it was Southern California. There were always flowers. And we'd make them crowns, and we'd have all these blossoms stored up in the wagon, and we'd conscript all the other kids, and we'd go up and down the street like a May procession, singing hymns to Mary and scattering blossoms. I'm so embarrassed. Okay. But that's Mary. That's a direct link to the pagan rituals of the goddess Flora and the Dionysian orgies. But we also celebrate May because of, they conscripted poor St. Joseph, patron saint of workers. But for a long time, May 1st has been a holiday internationally to honor the worker. And I decided, I was looking things up and trying to think about how to talk about this. And I thought, I didn't know this. So I thought I would talk to you about Mother Jones. I knew the name. I used to get the magazine. I did not know that she was Irish. So I have to talk about her. Mother Jones, Mary G. Harris Jones. She was born in Cork in Ireland, and there is no record of her birth. She was definitely born, but there was no record of her birth because this was during the famine, or right pre-famine. It was very hard times. They do have a record of her baptism, of course, in 1837. So given that they usually baptize newborns, we can assume she was born in 1837. And we know she died November 30th, 1980, which I was shocked, at the age of 93. No, that can't be right. I must have written the wrong. Carry the 1 and 3 is 4. And 4, 9. No, she died in the 30s. The 1930s. Why did I write that down? Because there was a big ceremonial thing for her in 1980 in her honor on the day of her death. So anyway, she was an Irish-American labor organizer and school teacher and a dressmaker, and she became a union organizer, and she was also part of communist organizations, and she was an activist. And it's really funny to look at her pictures because she looks like my maternal great-grandmother. They could be twins. It's hilarious. Okay. Her parents were tenant farmers. What does that mean? That means that the occupiers, the British occupiers, kicked them off the land and forced them to work like not even a sharecropper situation, because there was no allowance made for them to benefit from what they grew. They owed taxes that, they would have to pay the lord in the big manor house taxes from their own land. And they became victims of the Great Famine, which was when the Irish were artificially starved. Uh, the only food they really had free access to was what potatoes they could grow, not even a native crop. And when a disease hit the potatoes, they had no food and they starved to death. And the English didn't really care. They were still shipping everything produced in Ireland, food, animal products, dairy, animal meat, all of that, out for profit, out from Ireland. And as a result, so many died during this. It was a terrible time. And they went to Canada when she was 10. And I wonder about that, because the infamous ghost ships, the British just herded the dying Irish onto ships with no provisions, like no fresh water, no food, many of them with no clothes because they had no money to actually even, you couldn't go down to the thrift shop, just, And these ships were called ghost ships because they would arrive in Canada full of dead people. Somehow, Mother Jones, her family, when she was 10, got to Canada, and they were then victims of discrimination because of their immigrant status, because of their Catholic faith, and their Irish heritage. Because, the people before them who were not Indigenous, who went to Canada, were English, who were tossed out of England on ships because they were pulled out of prisons, and their situation was to be sent off to the colonies. Anyway, they were then the victims of discrimination because of those things. But she went to school in Toronto, and the school there was free, and she was given a stipend for finishing every semester. She eventually got a job, a really good job in Michigan, teaching at a convent in 1859. She was 23. It was really difficult for women to find employment. She got paid $8 a month. But she found it a very depressing place, and she didn't last long. She left Michigan. She moved to Chicago, and then she ended up moving to Memphis. But there's a story with that. In 1861, she married George Jones, an organizer for the National Union of Iron Molders, which later became the Union of Iron Molders and Foundry Workers of North America. And they represented the people who worked with steam engines in factories and mills and manufacturing, tending the ironworks machinery that ran all these big businesses. In 1867, so she'd been married 6 years, her husband and her 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, all under the age of 5, died of yellow fever. I just cannot even imagine. So what did she do? This shows her strength as an individual. She moved back to Chicago and opened a dressmaking business, catering to the upper class. And she did this in the 70s and the 80s, which turned out okay, but she had a difficult start at it because in 1871, 4 years after the death of her entire family, after she moved back to Chicago and started this business, her home, her shop, all of her possessions, all were lost to the Great Chicago Fire. But she did not leave. She did not give up. Talk about resilient. She helped her rebuild the city. She joined the Knights of Labor. Now, the Knights of Labor was mostly men, and she helped to organize strikes. And mostly they failed because the police in Chicago just shot and killed the protesters. I mean, that handled that. So, thankfully, thanks to her efforts, largely, by the mid-1870s, they were able to organize more than 1 million of these Knights of Labor, and this became the largest labor union in labor organization in the United States. But they ended, and it was really awful what happened. The Haymarket riots were in, I believe, I don't want to say where because I get it wrong, but there was a lot of labor related, worker class related social unrest with people dying. And somebody threw a bomb into a fight that was going on between Chicago police and strikers. And it was really bad. And the nights kind of dissipated because people kind of lost their will in a way. But Mary, she did not give up. She got involved with United Mine Workers. Now, we all know, if you have not seen it, there is a documentary on YouTube. You can watch it for free. It's old. I believe it was made in the 70s, roughly. And it follows a strike in the coal mining area of Appalachia. And it'll give you a taste of what this is about, the kind of violence that was involved. Well, Mary got involved with the United Mine Workers. She led pickets and she encouraged strikers to stay despite them bringing in scab workers and despite the threat of the militia. Now, she was a little retro in some of her ideas, and it might be difficult for us to completely relate, but product of her times. She said that working men deserved a wage that would allow women to stay home to care for their children. And there's a context for that. It feels, women work. Women have always worked. This is not a new phenomenon. But the infrastructure that supported them was even worse then than it is now. If you didn't have a large extended family to do your child care so you could go to work and help feed that large extended family, you had no choice. You still had to work. You'd all starve. And so there were many, many children left to their own devices all the time. And if you go back and look at old film, it's silent, it's black and white, it's very old, but you can see children in various working class slums, as they were called. You'll see what looks very much like, an 8 or a 9-year-old girl carrying a newborn. Why? Because the mother was in the mill for 16 hours a day. The child would pass the baby off in a couple of years and go work there herself. It was really an abysmal situation. So the strikers eventually, with her help, they got better organized and they started to see results. They started to get slightly better pay. It's all relative. And Mother Jones was especially active with the United Mine Workers Socialist Party of America, fighting for social justice. The organization it consisted of the wives and children of the mine workers, the group she worked with. So, they relegated her to working with the women, but she made a formidable group of them. Reese Blizzard, that's really his name, district attorney in Western Virginia, because remember, this is the mine workers, called Mother Jones, quote, the most dangerous woman in America in 1902. She comes into a state where peace and prosperity reign, crooks her finger, and 20,000 contented men lay down their tools and walk. So she was a little separated from the suffrage movement. She said, you don't need the vote to raise hell. She was laser focused on improving the lives of workers in general. And you have to pick your battles. And so people did criticize her for not advocating for women's rights. Well, she included the women in the workers' rights. She felt it was more important to advocate for workers. She called anti-women's rights. She was called anti-women's rights, but that's not true. She said, I'm not anti anything which brings freedom to my class. So she was really focused on class warfare rather than gender issues. She had a strong Irish accent, And this was very effective and charismatic. And she was a good speaker. She was able to rally people and impassion them. She would do visual aids and use props, sort of like our friend Katie in the House of Representatives. She pulled out a whiteboard, you know. She did all sorts of dramatic stunts, anything to attract people's attention and work up their emotion. She liked to tell stories about herself in which she had shown up authority. I kind of humble brag, you know. By age 60, now keep in mind here, we're talking, she's an old lady now, you know, she's a granny. By the age of 60, she took on the persona of Mother Jones. She embraced it. She would even pretend to be older than she really was. She would say her age was older than it was, and she wore outdated black old lady clothes, and she called the male workers that she supported, you know, in their strikes, she called them her boys. In 1900, the reality is that a sixth of children under 16 in this country worked 16-hour days. She was brought in by the United Mine Workers of America to help organize the wives of the workers. They would show up en masse with brooms and they would beat dishpans, you know, cooking pans, and yell, "Join the union," and just create a ruckus. And keep in mind, for women to do this was significant. She felt that young girls working, now this is where the old values come in. She felt that young girls working were robbed and demoralized. She felt it was an insult to their gender to expect them to do this. The rich denying children, it was an example of the rich denying children the right to go to school. These poor kids were working 16-hour days with no education. The rich were imposing it so the children of the rich could go to college. Lots has changed, huh? Lots have changed. So she talked about the poor working to service the elite. She encouraged workers' solidarity by telling Pennsylvania mill workers about the successes of New Jersey mill workers and how child labor laws had been better enforced because these workers in New Jersey united. Because of the strike, the mill owners claimed that if they had to pay adult wages because they had to hire the children and pay them lower wages because they couldn't afford to hire grown-ups, they'd have to close the mill. They couldn't afford it. Jones went in and brokered a settlement for the girls. Now, that didn't end child labor. It did improve the situation. Incremental change. In 1903, she organized mill and mine children. This was dramatic. It was called the March of the Mill Children. They did a 125-mile walk from the Pennsylvania Mill to Teddy Roosevelt's summer White House in Oyster Bay on Long Island. I do believe that's close to the Great Gatsby estate. They carried banners that said things like, "We want to go to school and not the mines." They had rallies every night in every new town that they stopped in. They played music, they did skits, they gave speeches in front of thousands of citizens. This is very smart. You know, they're revving up all kinds of people. Pre-internet, pre-telephone, well, telephone, but not really, pre-mass communication. So she showed many kids with missing fingers and disabilities from injuries, from the dangerous working conditions. There were no OSHA protections. She tried to get each local public newspaper to do publicity. Now, this was a problem. You know, this is why what she did with the skits and the performances was really smart, because often, almost all the time, the local papers would be owned by the stockholders would be the mill owners, and they've had excessive influence over what was put in the paper. Paper owners said, "Well, we can't publish the facts because the mill owners have stock in the paper." And she said, "I have stock in these little children and I'll arrange a little publicity." So at Long Island, at Roosevelt's summer White House, he wouldn't talk to her. The secretary told her, "Write him a letter and request a visit." He refused to meet with them. He never answered the letter she sent. But it did bring public attention. It didn't look good. It was not a good look. In 2023, a book came out called Kids on Strike, and it tells the story about this. I just thought I'd write that down. It sounded interesting. In 1912, in West Virginia, there was a strike. There was actually a shooting war going on between the United Mine Workers against the private army of the mine. So they would hire their own thugs. And that documentary, it's unbelievable. Martial law was declared. Mother Jones was arrested February 13, 1913. She was 76 years old. She was brought before a military court because it was martial law. And she was accused of conspiring to commit murder because of the killings that went on. She refused to recognize the legitimacy or the court martial. She was sentenced to 20 years in the state penitentiary. It wasn't clear how this worked, if they alternatively decided to give her house arrest or if she had been being held on house arrest before being put in the state pen. But while there, she developed double pneumonia, pre-antibiotics, very dangerous, and they didn't want her death on their hands because she was such a public figure. So after 85 days, she was released. So she got her health back, and several months later, she organized the coal miners in Colorado. And in 1913 and 1914, there was a United Mine Workers strike against the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. And this was called the Colorado Coalfield War. She was arrested, sent to prison again, and ended up in a hospital, the San Rafael Hospital. They escorted her out of the state of Colorado, and in a way it was lucky because as soon as she was gone, this escalated deadly situation, what became known as the Ludlow Massacre. There was a tent colony of strikers and their families. So basically, the families came to support the strikers and, you know, to cook meals for them, to wash their clothes, to provide them with emotional support. Their women, their wives, children, girlfriends all showed up, and they started a little tent village where the strike was, and this militia attacked it. And 21 people were killed. I think 19 of them were women and children. So after this, she got an audience with J.D. Rockefeller and convinced him to go visit the mines. In 1915, he went to the mines, and because of that visit, under the influence of Mother Jones, reforms were put in place. She was involved in the 1917 Bloomington streetcar strike, and in 1921, she tried to stop armed marchers who were miners from marching on, I don't know, the owners, confronting the militia. It wasn't real clear, but the point is she didn't want them to arm themselves and become targets themselves. She claimed she had a telegram. She approached them and did a big public thing. I have a telegram in my hand from President Harding, and he's offering to end these militias if you guys quit this armed march. But they called her bluff. Let us see the telegram. And she kind of fled in disgrace. And it said that she had a nervous breakdown, but I don't know, she was 84. So was it really a nervous breakdown, or was she just tired? Anyway, she continued to organize and to speak. Apparently she recovered. She organized and spoke up to her death. And before that, in 1925, she wrote her autobiography. She denounced West Virginia as medieval. She praised the governor of West Virginia, Governor Morgan, for protecting First Amendment rights. She said he could have shut down the Union publication that rallied Union members, but he didn't because he believed in the First Amendment. She lived with friends in her final years on a farm outside the city in the countryside of Maryland. And on May 1st, 1930, okay, it was 1930, that she died. That makes a whole lot more sense. I just couldn't read 3. I thought it was an 8. Sorry about that. She celebrated what she called her 100th birthday on May 1st, 1930, because she always exaggerated about her age. When I've given you her age, that really was her legitimate age. So she had celebrated her birthday, her 100th birthday on May 1st, but she died November 30th, 1930 at 93. The miners honored her. It took a while, but they organized and they created this gigantic stone memorial for her grave. October 11th, 1936, 50,000 miners came to honor her and place this stone. And October 11th is considered Miners' Day and Mother Jones Day. But that's the illustrious Mother Jones in honor of International Workers' Day, May Day, Beltane, Mary's Day, whatever. The weather's nice, the flowers are starting. So I hope you enjoy it today. And I hope this served as a bit of a distraction and an object lesson. What goes around comes around. Everything old is new again. Mother Jones' motto. So, slán go fóill, slánte.